Back in the summer of 2015, we launched our first episode of Primer, and we chose to start with the French Lebel, mother of all the modern rifles in the Great War. Now, because of early plans to do a collaborative process with the Great War, the first few episodes were French-themed and extremely rushed. In the end, their own internal issues over at the Great War stalled the release of the collaborative episodes for a number of months, and we kind of hurried for naught, and I've long felt that the Lebel deserved a much better episode. So, what you're about to see is a remake of episode 1, and it will appear as episode 1 so that you don't have to see two of the same gun. The older episode will still be available, and for YouTube specifically, I will be linking that in the description. So, thank you all, and I hope you enjoy this revisiting of a gun that really did need some more information. And by the way, I want to make sure I say special thanks to Ian for his assistance on this. We had some early access to his research materials for, well, his own personal book. And if you don't already know about that somehow, or if you're watching this way in the future and you want to know more about French rifles, well, take a look at that as well. Again, a link in the description. France had been the first country to adopt a smokeless powder rifle, stunning the world and kicking off a mad rush to re-equip armies across the globe. By the start of the Great War, nearly 30 years later, it was still standard issue, making this Lebel the oldest primary infantry rifle of the conflict. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the FUSILS Model 1886 Modifié 93, the famous Lebel. Let's get this over to the light box. The first smokeless rifle and an early repeater, this was an old world 51.5-inch long infantry rifle. That length does help though because it does have a tubular magazine with a capacity of 8 8mm cartridges, and they are loaded one at a time as slow as you please. You can leave a 9th on the lifter, but you may not put a 10th in the chamber because that was not part of French doctrine. This gun has no safety. All this makes for an overall weight of just over 9 pounds, so a tad hefty. Like all the guns in this series, the Lebel was not born in a vacuum, and I'm going to actually be touching on a number of concepts that we've actually discussed over the course of our series, because ultimately the Lebel is the crossroad rifle, the bridge between the black powder world and the smokeless revolution, and it represents the culmination of two particular rifle lineages, all the way back to the needle-fire chassepot rifle, which was the French standard in the Franco-Prussian War. The overwhelming loss of this war would inflame the French peoples and renew their focus competing with Germany specifically in terms of martial tactics and technology. As it applies to rifles, this means that when the Germans introduced the Mauser 1871, a metallic cartridge center-fire black powder single-shot rifle, well, the French had to respond with their own Gras 1874, a gun we have handled before and a natural evolution of the chassepot. In our exploration, we pointed out that it really was just an adaptation of the previous chassepot in many ways. At the time of adoption, the Gras was an entirely modern rifle. Metallic cartridge was the pinnacle of martial technology, well, unless you happened to notice the Swiss. As far back as 1867, they were fielding a magazine-repeating rifle, allowing a soldier multiple rapid shots on the battlefield before needing to reload. Now, if this seems like a clear upgrade, you're not a 19th century general. Magazines are complicated and expensive to produce. They could interrupt the pattern of drilled fire, and recall this is when people were firing in a line under officer command. They added weight, and if they actually were used for rapid shooting, that meant diminishing your ammunition supply rather quickly, which pre-mechanization, well, all that ammo was packed in. No, it's best to encourage one carefully aimed shot at a time. And by the way, a magazine might speed up the number of shots from a given soldier in a small amount of time, but if you average it all out, loading 8 rounds into a magazine and then firing 8 rounds takes almost the same amount of time as shooting 8 rounds singularly loading them between each shot. So the only real good is a burst of rapid fire, which is actually exactly what the French Navy wanted. As seen in one of our previous episodes, they would ultimately turn to the Kropatschek magazine system in a bid to give their Marine riflemen any advantage they could. That's against the often numerically superior indigenous forces that they would face. Basically, the Navy realized that when landing men on foreign shores, they preferred rapid, overwhelming fire to quickly break any opposing forces. The overall rate of fire being the same was fine so long as they could dump it as fast as they liked for a really demoralizing effect. Testing of repeaters had been ongoing since about 1867, by the way, and they would even skip adopting the 1874 Gras rifle, going straight for the repeating Model 1878, a hybrid of the Gras and Kropatschek system. The Army would eventually follow. In 1883, they set up their own commission for the matter. In 1884, they set up again, but better, now under General Tramond. Under his authority, a fairly large team of engineers began the long and careful task of selecting the next Army rifle. The first result would be the Kropatschek-based Model 1884, a close evolution of the Navy's 1878, which saw limited trial-esque adoption. Further minor improvements led to the Model 1885, most notable for its two-piece stock arrangement with exposed central receiver. Like the British Lee series, this provided a very robust stock configuration and saved on manufacturing difficulties with wood waste. Now, all that should seem pretty linear and safe. You have the Gras system being merged with the Austrian Kropatschek system, something else we've talked about before in episodes. But behind the scenes, French officers and engineers were all too aware that that tubular magazine wasn't going to last. Like I said before, a single loading magazine system does not speed up your rate of fire for an overall army unless you have some sort of packet loading system. If you can get multiple rounds into the magazine in one motion, in the same motion as a single cartridge, then you have increased the fire rate of a soldier overall. About this time, there were loading systems available in this category. The Mannlicher packet loader, soon to be adopted in Austria-Hungary, and the Lee system on the Remington Lee, which was very familiar to us today as a detachable box magazine. Rapid loading wasn't the only thing on the horizon, though. Swiss engineer Edard Rubin was, about this time, knee-deep in bullet research, having focused on the possibility of a small-bore high-speed projectile, allowing a longer-ranged, flatter trajectory shooting, better penetration, and still providing the same lethal effect. Throwing smaller bullets faster holds up mathematically, but actually doing it's a bit difficult. One challenge is that at speed, those little guys broke up, and so Rubin would invent the jacketed bullet, a soft core bullet with a hard but not too hard outer shell, which held everything together in firing and in flight. The only remaining issue with small bore was a limitation on gunpowder. Gunpowder is a fast burner, but the rate is basically fixed, and so compressing into a smaller case and trying to get enough of it to really huck a cartridge was a bit of a challenge. It could be done, it's just it left a lot of unburnt remnants and other fouling all the way down the barrel and in the action, quickly filling the rifling and leading to a loss of precision and possibly creating an overpressure situation. What small bore really needed was a new type of gunpowder overall. Paul-Marie Eugene Vieille was born in Paris in September of 1854, son of a mathematician. He would be educated at the same high school as his father taught, both of them that is, because his father actually moved, and he moved his studies as well. Paul would then head to Marseille to study the sciences, focusing on mathematics and chemistry, with a particular interest in engineering. From 1872 to 1873, he would take a special course on further mathematics before being accepted at l'École Polytechnique. Graduating from university, Vieille would earn a position in the Central Powder and Saltpeter Laboratories, where he quickly rose in stature thanks to his unique mix of mechanical and chemical talents. You see, he was very good at developing instrumentation, which is great in order to observe the stages and properties of explosions. Because of this, he would actually discover that nitrocellulose powder burns in layers. And in the course of that investigation, well, he discovered a really efficient way of producing it and therefore created smokeless powder, technically burning slower than black powder, but it could be compressed to yield more exponential results and burning all the powder in the case, making it not only powerful, but cleaner shooting. This would be poudre B, invented in 1884, smokeless powder, faster, flatter shooting, and no mess. It was a huge development, and the French government immediately made it top secret. Those in the know quickly started looking at the available magazine rifles in a whole new light. A new cartridge and a new rifle would have to be developed in deepest secret. They would have to be careful, take their time, because what they did next would create a revolution in arms technology, and replacing over 3 million rifles that were needed for the French army should be done correctly the first time around. We're going to do this as carefully and thoughtfully as we can. So yeah, while that 1885 Kropatschek style was being released on the surface, down below those in the know were working away at something far superior. Until January of 1886, that is. That's when Georges Ernest Boulanger was appointed Minister of War. After seeing smokeless powder's potential, he realized he wanted to be the man in charge when this hit the world stage. Quite a feather in the cap to be the boss when basically everybody soiled their collective pantaloons over your amazing bullet technology. So why wait? It's January, let's demand a new rifle and a new cartridge be ready by, I don't know, May. That's fine, I've gotta go on vacation after that. That should work out, right? Well, with that sort of deadline, the lumbering committee for a new rifle broke into separate working teams, each dedicated to one component of the gun. Everything non-native was dropped, and not just for national pride. There wasn't really any tooling in place for anything other than the 1885 Kropatschek Groth thing. Take that and let's slap a small bore smokeless round in there. The only problem is, on all the experiments so far, they've been based on the existing 11mm Groth cartridge. Yep, that's a big old black powder round. This early in ammo development, it would be a pain to make a whole new rifle for every experimental round, so just use existing guns with new barrels and a neck-down Groth case. That's what we've been doing behind the scenes. Well, if it wasn't efficient to do before the rush, we're not exactly going to develop a whole new breech face now, especially because we're separated from the bolt head team. They're working independently. The dimensions of the new French cartridge were hurried by two men, one adapting the casing and the other developing a jacketed 8mm bullet, which he based on the research again of Edard Rubin. So the result was a round-nosed jacketed 8mm bullet sitting in an awkward and unbalanced rimmed case with an 11mm style base, which was fine for the new tubular magazine rifle, but had some lasting effects on French small arms going forward. By the way, the M here stands for a Malicore, the jacketing material. Now, the shoulder-locking 1885 can't really handle this new screamer of a cartridge, so another engineer, one Colonel Bayonet, would be developing a symmetrical front-locking bolt head for the rifle. So the existing gun, the new cartridge, the new bolt design, and some other general improvements here and there, and surprisingly they actually had a functional rifle by May 1st. It was a mess of an amalgam, and about 2 years behind in magazine technology, but oh boy could it huck a bullet better than anybody else. It was leagues ahead of the competition on range, and so the gun would only see minor modification over the next year of extensive testing because no one was really thinking that hard on the magazine and the loading. That cartridge is just so impressive, we can't get past that. That thing's destroying everything. Look, it's a big deal. Faster, cleaner, long range, sure, but the trajectory, because it moves fast and flat, your point blank range, that distance in which you hit something the size of the torso of a man that you're actually aiming at, it's really long, and that means simpler aiming without adjusting the sights for longer ranges, and a more flexibly large area on the battlefield that you can hit with ease. Think of it like depth of field on a camera. So many more of the enemy are in focus for that one click. So, in April of 1887, the gun was officially adopted as the Fusil Model 1886 for the year of its invention. Now, of course, that name is very boring. Everyone likes giving their guns proper names. And in this case, I guess it's a Kropatschek magazine with a Gras bolt, but modified by Bonnet. So let's go with the Gras Bonnet Kropatschek 1886. No, that's awful. All right, let's do the Arisaka thing and name it after the head of the commission. We'll call it the Tromond 1886. That actually almost sort of stuck with a hyphen, that is. You see, the two most public names associated with this particular project once revealed were, of course, Tromond, and oddly, this guy named Nicolas Lebel, who was born in Saint-Mihiel in August of 1838. He enrolled in the Saint-Cyr Military Academy in 1855. In 1857, he joined the infantry as a second lieutenant, and during the Franco-Prussian War rose to captain and company commander. Although in September of 1870, he was captured and only released after the Treaty of Frankfurt, becoming involved in the overhaul of the French armed forces post-war. In 1876, he rose to major and became directly involved in rifle development. In 1883, he became the director of the Army's musketry school, which also served as home for the rifle testing committee. Also, Lebel sounds like the beautiful in French, so that's a really nice name. He basically invented the gun though, right? What did he do again? That's right, he was the guy who designed the 8mm jacketed projectile, which was mostly taken from the work of Edard Rubin. Okay. Oh well, let's call it the Lebel anyways. It sounds much nicer in the papers, makes us look fancy. Now, I'll forgive you for thinking that is our gun today, the one I have right here, but if you squint a little harder, you may see some differences, so let's keep digging. Pre-production of the Model 1886 began almost immediately, centered at Châtellerault. This was a shakeout to make sure of best practices for serial production. A little over 1,000 rifles were completed in this period until basically September of 1887. From there, 3 state arsenals were spun up for full-time production. Now, Châtellerault, of course, was the first, followed by Saint-Étienne and Tulle. Each manufacturer received a set of letter prefixes written in a stylized script to be used in front of their serial numbers in 100,000 unit blocks. New production equipment was purchased from the US, and the work week lasted 6 long days, but by the end of 1892, some 3 million rifles were completed, enough to completely rearm the French army, reserves, stockpiles included, a titanic achievement. Further production would happen in fits and spurts until 1904. This was largely to replace worn or lost stocks or to equip small expansions of the army. Barrel production was tracked separately and is represented by a 2 or 3 letter code on the barrel itself. I have those represented here for you. More details, by the way, on markings and manufacture can be found in English in a new book by one Ian McCollum, so give this a read if you're curious for more detail on identification. The new rifle was, of course, paired with a new bayonet. The 1886 was a departure from the usual blade. The emphasis was now put on maximum reach with minimum weight, and so the rigid but light cruciform spike was selected. Over 20 inches long, you wouldn't want a poke from this guy. Like many new pieces of tech, this bayonet would see several improvements in its first few years of production, as did these rifles. These little changes were simply rolled into the assembly line without having to turn and update all the previous guns at first. By 1893, the incremental changes did add up to a new designation. And so that's how we end up with what I have here today, actually, the Model 1886 Modefie 93, which again gives us our gun today. So while I walk you through this particular gun's configuration, I'll point out some of the changes. Alright folks, look at the size of this gun. I'm just gonna, without knocking anything around too much. Yeah, we're almost there. Oh, I made it all the way to the end. Okay, so from this side we've got our nice fine front sight. We've got some locking lugs for our bayonet and then a round resting spot for it right here. We have a stacking rod. This was actually added in 93. There's our spring clip to hold it on down. I can't speak. Let me roll this back. We've got a pencil style barrel all the way down, no steps, no nothing. We're into our lower band. We come right up to our rear sight, which is in its folded forward position. More on that in a second. Keep on going down, and look what happens. We separate out. We have a whole forestock, and then we have a buttstock. And this is pretty critical to the design of this rifle, because if you're thinking about trying to have the grain going in the correct direction for maximum strength, if you're thinking about using the least amount of raw wood, or at least smaller pieces of raw wood, this is brilliant, because realistically, you just need sticks of wood for this front section. There's no turn in it, so it's very efficient. These would come out of bars of wood, essentially. And then at the back, again, if you look at the rough shape of this, you can get it out of a single bar of wood of about this size. You're not having to waste nearly as much wood in production, and at the same time, it's actually stronger overall. This separation really keeps it from cracking in the most critical area. Now, the cost of that is you have a lot of heavy metal right in this position, so tit for tat, but I think this is a much stronger design. I actually like it quite a bit. Now, in terms of the action on this gun, we have a traditional cock on open gun. So if we make sure we don't have any danger beans in there, we're all good. Close this up, and I'll pull the very straight shaped trigger, let that forward, and we are now decocked as if we fired. If I open this up, watch the cocking piece, which did change shape in 93. Cock on, open. That's all a handover from the GRAW in terms of design. We have a separate front locking bolt head, and over top is a claw from the bolt body. Actually sits over top of a gas shield, another 1893 edition. This is the same kind of thing you see on a Mosin. It's also potentially susceptible to the same kind of jamming due to dirt and debris. But separate bolt head. By the way, this is all held on by a screw. They didn't want you disassembling this willy-nilly. You need to get out your screwdriver to do this, and honestly, the only thing I can really quickly take apart on this gun with a screwdriver is taking the bolt out. I'll leave you guys to use your imagination. Remove screw, twist parts appropriately, remove from gun. You get the idea. If we look at the action itself, which will require me to probably just adjust my camera ever slightly. Right now, our carrier or follower or elevator or whatever term you would like to use, depending on how confusing you want to be, the lifty doodle is down. And so if we were to follow it down in here in a way that I really can't get the camera to show too clearly, you can kind of see the ring of it there. There is an actual follower down in there, an actual cap like on a shotgun is pushing rearward and putting the cartridge in there. There's a cartridge stop about here. So the length of the cartridge doesn't matter that much. It'll stop the next one. When this is tipped down for the first time, it depresses that stop for just a moment during its path, and it releases one cartridge. And the next one snaps into place and is stuck there. So that's really good because we are not susceptible to jamming because of differences in length of cartridges. Now, if I keep pulling the bolt back, with gusto, it'll actually tip it up. That's because there's just a simple lug on the back that's sitting in a raceway on the bolt, and the bolt, when it comes to a halt, this is actually the bolt stop in a way. This is what's halting the rearward motion of the bolt and therefore tipping this up. It'll offer us our next cartridge. When we bolt forward, we'll feed in the chamber, and then see this little guy here sticking up? As long as he's sticking up, he is going to depress that lifter in there. So if I were to close this, see, ready? Click. At that moment, this was driven down, and if I reopen the bolt and turn back, we'll see she's down. And when I come all the way to the rear again, she'll pop back up. You think you guys are getting the idea? We saw this, of course, with our Kropatschek guns, which this gun definitely favors in appearance. Now, if you want to have a single loader, then you can flip this lever, and I'm going to go to the extreme and go ahead and put that back down and show you what happens when you flip this guy. If you flip this guy with your lifter down, you're gonna get, oh God, it weighs 40 pounds. Keep going. Boom. She's gonna pop her back up and keep her up. And when you bring the bolt back forward, there's nothing for it to strike, so therefore, pop and pop, she stays up. Single loading, only with the magazine in reserve. Now, as far as sights go, this one's pretty standard, although it tends to wrap a couple features together at once. If you look carefully, you'll see it's stepped on this side, but we also have a ladder. So if we were to fold her back, we could use these step markers to get nice and tight for some of the early ranges. If we're in a quote-unquote battle site position, we can be right here for, I believe, 250 meters. And then we read off this notch here, which, by the way, is offset slightly to the left of center. See that guy there? Not quite down the center line. Neither is the front sight either, so it works out. Now, if you want really long range, essentially volley, well, then we can just flip this up as you would and just dial it in on the ladder. So this gives you a wide range of selection for what you could potentially shoot at. And again, we can tell this is an 1893 because of the two reinforcing bands around the barrel. By the way, those collective changes I mentioned, none of them forced a recall, so they would all only have been done ad hoc if not for the adoption of a new cartridge. In 1898, the French went with the latest in bullet technology, the Spitzer, or pointed bullet, which was also made of solid brass in this case. The Spitzer improved precision and further flattened trajectories. It would soon be followed by the Ball D-AM, which just stood for modified primer. Basically, a lip was put over the primer edges to keep them from escaping once fired. The introduction of Ball D did force a modification of existing Lebels, not just a sighting issue. The chambers were modified and a new follower was added down in the tube magazine to better fit the pointed round. During this update, guns were also brought into the Modifie 93 pattern at the same time, and so it's extremely hard to find a Marshall Lebel in the original 1886 configuration. Almost all were turned over. All right, we did it, guys. We now have exactly what is in my hands today, and so that means that we can take a closer look thanks to one of Bruno's animations. First, we'll press 8 rounds of 8mm Lebel into the magazine tube, each one clicking past the cartridge stop. Original doctrine says the magazine was held in reserve, so let's switch to single shot. The lifter, sitting here in the background, is tipped and held up by the right side magazine cutoff lever. In this position, the finger-like extension is also lowered, meaning the bolt handle root does not strike it when closing. This leaves us with a perfectly normal single-shot rifle. To re-engage the magazine, we'll flip the lever again, which unlocks the lifter and projects the finger back skyward. It does not, however, lower the lifter, so we will have to close the bolt in order to feed the next round. By the way, this gun does use a traditional 2-stage trigger powered by a V-spring. On opening, this lug on the bottom of the bolt strikes a projection on the back of the lifter. That means it functions as both a bolt stop and an actuator. Now, the method of stopping cartridges is critically important in this system. The lifter itself acts as a cartridge stop whenever it is in the raised position. When dropped, it seesaws an even lower catch down at the bottom of the rifle. This halts the next cartridge just as the first is freed by the lifter. And again, when the lifter rises, that lower catch frees the next cartridge to strike up against the lifter to be the next to fed into the system. Returning to the basics, we have a rotating bolt head with claw extractor and a dead simple screw-in ejector. From here, I think you have it. So we'll just wrap this up and get it over to Mae for a demonstration.
Après lutter le canon Bavarois des Saxons, soit sans peur et sans reproche, soit sans peur et sans reproche. La liberté à la France verse à boire, de la gloire à plein bidon, buvons.
Now, before anybody jumps on us for having had the sight flipped back during that firing, you would usually use this flip forward with the battle sight. I believe that's set for 250 meters. This gun doesn't like doing that. It just sighted a lot better and performed well enough on range with it back. Back is what we went with, although normally, yes, you're right, it would be forward. Okay, let's get back into our story, though. We need to discuss the service life of the Lebel. At the time of its adoption, French colonial forces were spread pretty far across the globe, so the earliest deployments of the new Model 1886 would be against really poorly equipped foes, which of course resulted in French annexation. The earliest conflicts I know of were in Senegal and the Ivory Coast in 1892. They may also have been present for the Second Franco-Dahomey War. They were definitely present in the Second French expedition to Madagascar in 1894, but that was mostly decided with artillery. From there it was off to China and the Boxer Rebellion, where the Lebel was put to work once more alongside so many arms we've actually already discussed in this show. And by 1900, by the way, the Lebel was pretty much done for in terms of technology. That rushed production, there was a price. The Model 1886 was too revolutionary. Whereas previously many armies had been slow to adopt new technology, the clearly superior ballistics of the small-bore smokeless cartridge got everyone moving. Soon every other major power on Earth had a smokeless rifle, and they had the benefit of working in the open and being able to better integrate new commercial technologies. Recall, the bulk of the Lebel 1886 production was wrapped by 1892, but at that same time, we already see the Austro-Hungarian Mannlicher had been adapted to semi-smokeless cartridges and then smokeless in an 1890 carbine that, with just a few changes, became their 1895 rifle. Both of these used well-balanced vertical magazines and rapid loading end blocks. The same clip technology was improved in the German Gewehr 1888 and applied to the Italian Carcano 1891. The Belgians adopted the Mauser 1889 and its simple stripper clip. A trials gun from their adoption was merged with a native Russian design and a little bit of the aspect of the French Lebel even, resulting in the Mosin 1891, another stripper clip fed gun. Britain went further, adopting a detachable box magazine in 1888 with the Lee Metford, although they kind of flubbed this by not actually using them to load the guns. All those guns avoid several major issues that come with tubular magazines. We've explored these before, but let's hit them one more time. Tube magazines are slow loading. They usually don't work with any sort of loading device. They have shifting balance. As they are loaded or unloaded, the balance point changes on the guns. This can also affect the barrel harmonics and therefore precision. They may also suffer chain detonation. The tip to primer issue was more acute after Spitzer ammunition was introduced, and the fear became that detonation of rounds in the magazine may occur readily. This was admittedly rare though. But in the years I've done this show, I have found a few documented incidents. Honestly, France needed an update already, and they were well aware of it. A stopgap was found in the Berthier, a clip-fed 3-shot carbine, which replaced the Lebel in special circumstances. We have a whole episode done on those already though. The Berthier wasn't good enough to be a complete replacement for this particular rifle. French authorities wanted to push even further ahead of the rest of the world in their next attempt. They wanted to be the first to issue a standard autoloader. Unfortunately, their rush had given them the worst possible cartridge for exactly that. This awkwardly shaped doodad was a royal pain to feed through anything other than a 100% controlled feed firearm, making development of automatic systems for the 8mm Lebel extremely limited. We'll actually talk more about that next time, and we'll see maybe one of those autoloaders. The short story is, because of the promise of developing an automatic rifle, France never really replaced the Lebel. It stuck around as the official rifle through 1900, through 1910, and all the way up until war were declared. And with that, the roughly 3 million Lebel that they had on hand became absolutely critical. So how did it fare in the conflict? The short answer for the Great War is actually good enough at first. Fairly early in the war, armies were still using massed infantry attack, and the majority had long, awkward rifles on both sides. So this thing didn't stick out too bad at the start. Slow loading wasn't too terribly bad thanks to the 8-round magazine count, with 1 sitting on that lifter, so 9 rounds before you have to reload. Find somewhere to hide for a little while, right? Production was only restarted at Toula for the war. Existing stocks of parts were used up, and then new ones were cranked out. All in all, only 217,000 or so Lebels were actually made, though, during the course of everything, all the way to 1918. That's because this guy didn't remain the standard French firearm for the entire war. Instead, it was very quickly replaced with another. Unfortunately, this had very little to do with tactical doctrine and more to do with the fact that the other gun was easier to produce. You see, they took the Colonial Berthier rifle and fitted it with a Lebel barrel and Lebel bayonets and fittings and called it a day. This resulted in the 0715 rifle we've covered before. This actually became the main infantry rifle for France through World War I, kind of like how the 1917 outproduced the Springfield 1903 in the US. Still, with so many Lebel on hand, whatever could be repaired was, and being a frontline rifle, most saw damage at some point. Toula would handle their fair share, but interestingly, a whole factory had gone out of business around 1904, Manufacture d'Armes de Paris au Saint-Denis. This was restarted using refugee workers from the Belgian Fabrique Nationale, and they worked not only to repair rifles, but to produce new barrels, which again could be used on both old Lebels in for repair and new Berthier 0715s. Although this does lead to an interesting point, the real trouble with the Lebel didn't start until trench fighting kicked in. Lumbering up and out of the trenches wasn't easy, I'm sure, but an additional challenge appeared in the form of close-range fighting, which required rapid target acquisition. Some repaired Lebel can be found with improved sights. This was done during and after World War I. Experience in the trenches revealed that fine, sharp sights of the old Lebel and Berthiers just weren't easy to align in a hurried, short-range conflict, so they were altered to a new, super chunky pattern. Here, the nearly 5mm front sight post and rear notch were quick to align, but if you needed a finer shot, you could use that notch cut right down the center of the front sight. Also, during the war, some Lebel rifles were fitted with dust covers, which stayed right along with the bolt during operation. Again, you can learn more about these and other features from Mr. Ian McCollum's book, or something like this Forgotten Weapons video we have here. Okay, so you can sight a bit better. Mud's not getting in as easily. We're still pretty long and awkward though. Nothing can be done there. What else is a bother with the Lebel? The Rosalie, now nicknamed after a song you might just have heard recently. We'll first remove the quillion, which snagged on the battlefield and served no real purpose anymore thanks to the stacking rod being added to the gun. Second, they simplified the latch button for faster manufacture, just less rounded corners. Materials rationing later led to changes in the metal handles. Once nickel, they were changed to brass, and then brass rationing meant that the brass exteriors were set up with cast iron filler. And really, that's about it for modifications to the standard Lebel. None of them, of course, really addressed the worst issues with the rifle, making it possibly, this is hard to say, the worst mainline infantry rifle of the war. Gasp. Or was it the worst? It was accurate enough for glass, and there is a whole other study involved in World War I optics. One day we'll actually do a sniper special. Of course, other mainline rifles were being scoped, and some certainly excelled in the role above the old French gun and its pencil barrel. I guess what I'm fishing around for here is there anything the Lebel could actually do better than some other gun? Any war critical role where this gun is surprisingly good over anything else? Well, it turns out the Lebel can straight up yeet a grenade across the battlefield like no other. You see, the rifles would be placed on the ground in order to fire grenades. The shock wave from firing at higher pressures often ate up the rifle stocks, if not their locking lugs. And so we often see things like the British Mark III EY. This is a gun wrapped up in wire or surrounded by clamps to keep the stocks from bursting when firing rifle grenades. The Lebel, with its two-piece stock, didn't really suffer any harm. Its long barrel was also an aid in both pressure curve and easily gross aiming the firearm, making it perfect for, one of the French's weapons of war, their primary weapons of war, the Viven-Bercier rifle grenade, a device that became a deciding weapon in the Entente's anti-machine gun assaults. As we covered in our Shosha episode, French riflemen would work in tandem with a light machine gun to approach, suppress, and then effectively light mortar an enemy machine gun out of operation. Hey, it's 1 point on the board. Unfortunately, that's pretty much the only point. Overall, the Lebel was just too rushed from the start and then stayed in inventory too long as they waited for that dream rifle that was on the horizon. The Germans had rushed a response to the Lebel and ended up with the more advanced Gewehr 1888 right away, and that proved to have some real faults, so they later updated to the Gewehr 1898, a frankly fantastic rifle. They adapted that into a carbine, which wasn't good enough, so they did it all over again. The French remained stuck to the Lebel, and as a stopgap did the Berthier in more and more varieties. During the war, it proved mostly adequate at best, and was, as I said, ultimately replaced by the Berthier in production. But the symbol of the Lebel remained strong, as it was almost exclusively used in period imagery. The Lebel was the very icon of the determined poilu, inseparable from the French identity. Also, Berthiers kind of look weird. Following the war, the Lebel would be declared obsolete in 1920, but that only halted production and allowed the lines to be dismantled. Economic depression, political unrest, and another program to adopt an auto-loading rifle, the best rifle ever, we're gonna get it this time, kept stalling attempts to finally move past the Lebel and Berthier rifles. So the old 86 saw additional updates like the conversion to Ball N, another improved round, but outside our scope for today, most French surplus will have the telltale N stamped over the chamber, indicating this update, which was done in 1932. Just a few years later, they would finally adopt a new gun and new cartridge, being the MOS 36 in 7.5mm, although the ammunition was decided some years in advance, which meant the Lebel did have some lead time to see attempts at conversion to 7.5 and a stripper clip feed. They also had double-stack magazines. Nice. But this process proved to be way too expensive for mass adoption, and M27s remain rare. Instead, they were maintained as is all the way up until about 1937, when repair was finally discontinued at Tula. But that's because they were going to use that same tooling for repair to do a different Lebel conversion. That's the R35 carbine, which is really just as simple as you'd think. Same chambering and everything. More on this particular little gun another day. Honestly, that just means that by the time World War II rolled around, the Lebel was still on the battlefield, although a lot more Berthiers had shown up in the interim and a lot of them were short. Sure, it was mostly in the colonies freeing up standard rifles, but a lot of fighting happened out there, although again, story for another day. Instead, we'll just point out all the places where the not so little rifle who could turned up on the globe. Oh, look at that. Everywhere. Superior or inferior to a man, that's a lot of reach, and a lot of influence on martial history. Still, we do care about the opinion of at least one singular rifle woman. So let's get Mae in here and get her opinion on the long arm of the poilu. All right, this is the part in the show where I take the rifle and the markswoman and we put them back together. Ooh, it just happened. And then we get Mae's opinion on handling the gun. Now, first impressions when you're handed this ergonomically, other than it being kind of old and beat up, what are you feeling? What's happening here?
Well, folks, first off, this gun is long and it is heavy. But when I am first handed it, surprisingly well balanced. Not bad. You're thinking, oh, yeah, I can do this. I can handle it. The balance is there. I can shoot this thing. And your problem comes when you load your rounds. As you're loading more rounds, it slowly starts to get front heavy. Not fantastic. That does kind of suck. Although they could have added a semi-pistol grip down here, that would have helped me to kind of balance it better and hold up the front a little bit easier, but no, let's forget about that. There is one thing I did notice though. The forestock on this one is actually a little bit loose. Weirdly didn't make any sort of difference. I didn't think that it affected me while shooting whatsoever, but...
Yeah, that's just this one, by the way. A lot of them are tight, some of them are loose. It's been 100 and some odd years, but it is interesting to note that you would think that much play in a forestock would really give you a hard time.
Yeah, if you can see it, like it's actually a significant amount of wiggle. It really didn't seem to affect... I didn't think as a shooter it affected me.
You notice it constantly when you're handling the thing. Once you start pulling the trigger, you don't notice it at all. So good on that the stock fit didn't turn out to be that critical in this particular instance, although we're not pushing it way, way out. On a pencil barrel like this, that stock fit would get to be more critical at longer ranges in terms of precision shooting. So that could or could not be a problem. I'm not 100% sure. That's something to run down in Arsenal records and see if that's a thing that they had to address. While we're talking about it, you mentioned no semi-pistol grip, and I want to say it's highly unlikely that they would have put one on here because a lot of the stock configuration was done in order to conserve wood. And we've talked about this before, but trying to get a semi-pistol grip on a gun means having a very specific grain direction available to you in the wood in the full length of a rifle usually. So if anybody was going to get a semi-pistol grip out of their gun without using a ton of wood, it would have been the French, but it looks like they probably did not prioritize that, especially because this gun is a single loader to a degree. And so they favor straight wrist sometimes, just like you would for trap shooting, because the idea is that you can get it up and down off the hip faster while throwing singular rounds in there. So they're not quite at that phase of magazine only, so therefore emphasizing having a semi-pistol grip.
And I would agree with that consensus, but the problem is that with this particular gun, like I said, it really would help with the balance, with you balancing on your shoulder better, I think.
Right. No, when you're putting it up and all that weight's on your left hand, being able to pull some of it into your right would be a huge boon.
Yeah. But anyway, getting into the actual action of this gun. So I would say that it's not particularly stiff or smooth. It's kind of middle of the ground. However, this being a cock on open, I do wish they had made this bolt handle a little bit longer just to kind of give me some extra, let me have an extra little bit of torque on that. That way I could manipulate it much easier. And I don't know if you can see it here on camera. I'll pop a little picture up there for you so you guys can see it. There's a small little section here at the top of the bolt that I feel like that would be very susceptible to mud and muck. And unfortunately, the way it's set up, it's a piece of metal here and you're needing to bolt up and you have to pass over it. And I feel like if there's any sort of thing that gets in between, you'd have some jams you'd have to clear out a blowout or something. We
saw this on the Mosin. So, and then over on a show called In Range, they did some testing with mud on the Mosin and had something get in there. And that's always been a concern, which is that you have a bolt body and a separate bolt head, and they have to stay together somehow on extraction. And so what they tend to do is the bolt head tends to be in there, the claw comes over and then pulls that thing out. But when the claw is down, there's an air gap. And so something can get in there. And when you try to come up, it can't clear and you get a jam. It's a possibility. And it's one that's easily eliminated with other designs.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were talking earlier in the show, you mentioned that they do have a shroud that they have put over this before. It's not doesn't come standard, but that would be useful in this situation.
There was a wartime dust cover.
Yep. So anyway, the other thing, mentioning the action and cycling the bolt, it is kind of an elbow and a wrist breaker in that over time, like the Mosin, it kind of wears on you. I don't think it wears as bad as the Mosin, but I still think that it's something that can wear you out as you continue. Because if you notice, when I opened this just now, if you open it gingerly enough, that lifter is not going to lift up. You actually have to pop it in order to have the lift go up and pop up your next round. So that's something that you have to be aware of. And unfortunately, you can even accidentally pop it too hard. And we've totally had it happen before where a round is popped out of the gun. A live round just pops out as well. So now you not only have you lost, you managed to successfully eject your empty cartridge, but you have now just ejected your live one too. That's not very helpful in this situation. And then you have to go through the whole process of cycling again in order to get to your next round. Not the best, in my opinion. And unfortunately, it is something that you just need to be aware of. It's not something you want to shoot for a long period of time. The magazine cutoff is incredibly stiff. I've handled a few others before, and I can't say I've noticed a difference. They're all pretty well stiff, and I don't know if that's age of the pieces or if that's just how they kind of came. But no matter what, they've always been incredibly stiff to operate.
You are moving several springs when you turn that thing.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if that's just how they all are. But yeah, aside from that, I think that pretty much covers everything.
No, honestly, it's a lot like handling a Kropatschek. Like, it really just is a smokeless powder Kropatschek, and with a slightly different magazine cutoff. I think, to me, the only thing that stands out is the slab-sided receiver looks a little more modern, because obviously there's some benefit there. And then that's really it. I think you said it reminded you of a shotgun almost in appearance.
Yeah, and just that, like, if you think of it, it's just a two-piece stock with all of this metal and action in between. It just looks a lot like it in terms of just appearance, general appearance.
Yeah. Same problems with the Kropatschek, by the way. Whenever she goes to feed, if you bolt open while it's locked in single shot and you eject the casing and you switch the magazine over to, magazine fire, it does not present a round. You must bolt forward, down, bolt back, and then get your round out. So you have to do a dry cycle when you switch. We saw that with the Kropatschek.
Which is still incredibly annoying, and unfortunately, that's just how these were all set up. Like,
right.
It's never a quick action cycle sort of thing.
No, the tube loading military rifle was really dead about the year this gun came out. It was really poorly timed that they stayed with that Kropatschek system on this gun. So we talked about handling. You mentioned the overall length. By the way, I want to make one apology. I say the tube loader was obsolete when this gun was adopted. The length to us seems obsolete. At that time, it was not. This is still a time in which cavalry is on the battlefield, in which people are firing in two lines. Not all the time, but we're moving away from that. Not really cavalry. We're moving away from the two-line thing slowly. But at the time, it needs to be long enough for firing in two lines reasonably. That's what they did. And then there's also an element of having that plus the Rosalie.
I was going to mention that. You can tell they were concerned about the weight because it's like incredibly light and thin.
Yeah, no, without this piece, the sheath, this is a very light bayonet, and you can tell they're trying to cut down on the weight of that gun. But the reason you still have these big spikes with this long reach is because bayonet fighting was still an expected act. And then also, there is a certain element of some of the old guards still standing around thinking of riflemen as being alternating as pikemen. And so the ability to sort of defeat a cavalry charge with rifles as a not a fired weapon, but as a melee weapon. Obviously, we know once you have repeating magazines, you can just shoot the guy on the horse. You don't really need to go through all this, but there's some transitional doctrine that's going on at the time. So those are forgivable. It's the magazine that's sort of like they should have known better. But what are we talking about when we fire the gun, though? Because you've only talked about handling it. When we pull the trigger, what happens here?
Now, you guys have already seen my range footage from earlier, but I'm just going to try to walk you guys through it. We've already talked about the action, cycling out rounds. We're good there. When I go to line up the sights, it's interesting. So I don't know if maybe like the front sight was, adjusted a little bit or whatnot, but honestly, I think it shoots better with the sight slipped back as opposed to forward in their battle sight configuration.
On this gun.
On this one.
Gun, not all of them.
No. It was really unusual for us to test it out and kind of see the difference, but yet my performance was better with them flipped back. So that's definitely a unique experience with this particular gun, so something new there.
It's had a lot of years of private ownership. Somebody might have not known to flip it forward and gone ahead and cleaned up the front sight at some point to get it just knocked down. So you never know. So the good thing is we had the ability to adjust the sights, which is what you want. Exactly.
And now this is, moving from the sights, this is just a regular, it's very straight trigger, and it's a two-stage trigger. There's first part of the stage, like you can feel nothing. And then the second part, it gets really heavy and the brake is incredibly clean in there, which was really nice. Recoil, I would say, was pretty significant. I want to say, 8mm Lebel is a pretty good cartridge. It's a pretty heavy gun. And then on top of that, I don't think this butt plate does us any favors in terms of just feeling that recoil all up in your shoulder. I mean, it's very square. It kind of reminds me of the 95.
Yes, the Mannlicher 1895 has a very acutely rounded butt plate that tends to put more pressure into your shoulder than it should. The Lebel is a much flatter butt plate than that, but still slightly domed, ever so slightly.
Yeah, you can feel it right there in the center of the dome part of it, but just that square edges up into your shoulder with that little bit of dome, I really kind of felt it at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's also throwing a lot of mass around. The weight helps to a degree. And then the other thing is, don't forget, this one again had a loose forestock. It may just be allowing it to slide a bit in your grip. So it could also be partly this one. But 8mm Lebel is kind of a kick to the shoulder, even among other cartridges. Like, it gets into that 30-06 range of perceived recoil. And I've actually had conversation with this with people with 8mm Lebel specifically. There's something about that cartridge that, despite what you may see for joules of energy and overall actual recoil, something about that cartridge seems to lend itself to a weird perceived recoil on almost every gun that chambers it, and I can't put my finger on why. It just always seems like one of those cartridges that beats you up a little bit. So heavy recoil, trigger, sights.
Yep, everything about those sights were terrible.
Yeah, they were shallow, right?
They're incredibly shallow. Like, I don't understand. This gun is so long. The sight radius on this is fantastic, and yet really tiny sights. What is that? I feel like that's such a waste right there. But yeah, that pretty much covers shooting. I mean, I thought I was fairly accurate. I did notice at one point, in the very beginning, like once I started to see a few shots, I was hitting a little bit up to the right. And when I'd made an adjustment, I had been hitting like just above the A. I made a slight adjustment in mid-shot. And I think like my last like 5 or 6 shots, like hit almost like just right of dead center. And it was perfect, like, because I was aiming at the A just perfect at that point. So yeah, honestly, again, I thought that was pretty accurate considering for the range we were shooting at. Now,
don't forget, we covered on this gun that they did have a sight change, because these were the standard sights, and then they were going to be standard on the 0715 and Berthier's and things like that, and then they realized this is not great for fighting close in. And you've handled those Berthier's with the chunky sights. If you had to quickly sort of, line up and shoot, would you prefer these little fine sights, or would you prefer those nice blocky ones from the Berthier?
I'd prefer the blocky ones just because these are so difficult to read, especially for a quick shot. Yet I definitely took my time with this one, unfortunately.
And yet I feel that at range, the Berthier ones are very difficult for me to use because the sighting notch is sort of an inversion of what you're used to, so there's the conditioning, but also that blocky post takes up so much of your vision. When you're trying to aim at something very small and far away with those blocky sights, you end up covering a lot of what you're aiming at. It makes it very difficult to estimate what's happening downrange.
But we are shooting at fixed targets, so it's not like I've got a tiny target that's moving around. I've got a fixed, fairly large human-sized target that I am aiming at. In this situation, for the target I'm shooting at, these are more detrimental because I couldn't it's really difficult to see what you're seeing.
Right. So I would argue these are better for longer ranges, and that's what they expected when they adopted the gun. However, the chunky sights are definitely better during the Great War. Okay, so that kind of leads us to the final question, I guess, which is, how comfortable are you with this on the battlefield? And I want to make sure I remind everybody of one thing. We had a conversation about the Mosin Nagant, the Russian rifle. And while technologically superior to this gun, it had some production issues that made from gun to gun, it was very risky what kind of quality you got, and it was also very exhausting to use. And now you've told me that this gun was made in a very, control. All the Lebels are going to fire. Like they were done very well at the Arsenal system. So the Lebels are reliable, but they are very dated technology. They're the oldest possible smokeless gun you can get. And they're starting to have some exhausting handling issues. So we're getting kind of close to a comparison to talking about the Mosin. So where does this fall? Because the Mosin got like a slight no. So where's this at?
So yes, the Mosin did get the slight no because we couldn't really bank on getting a good one versus a bad one. There was no, it was just basically luck on what you got. But with the Lebels, like you just said, consistency. We were guaranteed to get a good Lebel. So while this may be a tube loader, it's at least still smokeless. It's a decent cartridge. 8mm Lebel's pretty good. It's got a good impact with it.
Fly straight hits hard.
Yes, absolutely. And it fired reliably too. I honestly, on range, I was expecting a poor performance than what we were given, and yet even after 100 years, it's still firing really well. It's fantastic. So I would give the Lebel a yes, but it's obviously not my preferred one of choice. If I have to go into war with it, it would be something that I would take, but it isn't something that I would necessarily take if maybe I had like a Berthier as a secondary option.
For my sake, this one's tricky, because if I'm sat in a trench, I'd take it. If I'm firing rifle grenades, I'd take it. If I'm using it as a sniper, I'd probably take it. I don't know that much about the precision of the barrels, rather.
What if you have to leave the trench, though?
That's the problem.
It's not easy to climb over a trench for these things.
We should play it again, because I had that footage in here of some men, hopping over the trench, and the first guy in the foreground has a Berthier, and he just goes right up over the trench, and you can see in the background the dude with what appears to be a Lebel just struggling to get out of the trench. And I don't want to waste any time moving with something this laborious, especially if I have no rapid loading technology. So it's just what's in the magazine. And then I'm having to sort of fight the gun to run the gun in a way. I'm not saying it's that hard. You get used to it. And we kind of have this with the Lee Enfield. People are like, well, once you get used to loading the Lee Enfield, it goes very smoothly. And I'm like, well, that's great. But we're talking about conscripts, we're talking about minimal training time. The gun that works the most naturally is going to be the best gun. And so those things put the Lebel very low, extremely advanced for its time in a lot of ways. And when I make fun of the magazine, I'm making fun of it for not being cutting edge. It was definitely perfectly adequate technology the year it came out. It's just that the very next year, everyone became obsessed with packet loading. So it was poorly timed. But when we're getting into the Great War, you get into a hairy area. Like the Lebel is starting to be one of those guns that I don't know if I'm that comfortable with or not. I'd give it like a hazy yes, but boy, is it hazy.
Yeah, you're in the same group as me. And honestly, I would say this pretty much is on par with how we originally discussed it in the first episode. It just barely would get a yes in our books.
Yeah, and then there's this element, by the way, we've said yes to some black powder guns.
We actually have.
They're magazine repeating, and they're usually carbines. Like, I don't know that we've said yes to a magazine repeating a long arm, because the handling, the shorter range means the black powder doesn't matter as much. You're going to hit at those short ranges. The maneuverability counts for a lot, and this thing suffers a lot in that. So it's like, we're now in this weird space where we now have a long, very antiquated tube loader smokeless powder gun. Does the smokeless powder really make it worth it versus a carbine repeater black powder rifle? And I'd argue, maybe not, depending on the task.
It just realistically depends on what you're doing. Yeah, I would agree. So if you're hanging back, not having to move around a lot, sure, yeah, it would be good for the long distance. I would agree with your assessment on that. But if I need to get up and move, it's going to be a bit difficult.
It starts to make you really nervous. Yeah. Like, I mean, really nervous to think about moving with that while under fire.
And also trying to keep it clean in the process.
But I still say, weirdly, probably ranks above the Mosin, and I get a lot of hate for that. It's just a numbers game. It's just a failures per million number game is why I'm cautious about the Mosin. I think it's over-engineered. This is probably under-engineered in some ways.
I personally love the Mosin, but that's not one I would consider taking into battle. Even though I enjoy one and I own one, but I still wouldn't take it into battle.
All right, so now that we're back to talking about something other than the gun we have in here,
hooray!
Overall, the Lebel is the softest, haziest of yeses, but it makes us uncomfortable, and yet it was the symbol of the poilu. So that should tell you something about the struggle that they went through in that particular war. It's a good thing they had the 75 cannon.
It's the flan of yeses.
All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and tune in for the next. Have a good one.
Bye, guys. Hey guys, just a small update. Othais and I are trying to pull ahead in production so that we can yet again leave town, this time for a quick trip up north. Promise we will be back soon. For any updates on our trip, follow us on Instagram. Otherwise, as always, thank you all for the support and hope y'all enjoyed this much needed remake of our first episode.